All right. Hi, everyone. Welcome to Arts Plus Change, hosted by the University of Rochester's Institute for the Performing Arts in partnership with the Office of Equity and Inclusion, the Paul J. Burgett Intercultural Center, 540 West Main, Incorporated, Create a Space Now, Eastman Institute for Music Leadership, the Warner School, and the Rochester Fringe Festival. My name is Missy Full-Smith. My pronouns are she, her, and I'm your conference host for this session with Andrea Gluckman. We would like to acknowledge with respect the Seneca Nation, known as the Great Hill People and keepers of the Western Door of the Haudenosaunee. We take this opportunity to thank the original caretakers on whose ancestral lands the University of Rochester currently resides in Rochester, New York. As we come together, we also want to honor the many lives tragically taken too soon in recent events by acknowledging the need for a commitment to constant action and attention surrounding systemic issues that continue to impact each of us to this day. While we have encouraged each presenter to make every effort to create brave and safe space, we would like to encourage you to attend these sessions in the way that you need to attend. While we know discomfort allows for growth, we would also like to remind you that you have agency to make decisions that keep you safe as we embark on potentially difficult content and discussions. As we are all here to learn and grow, we welcome you to challenge ideas, but ask you to challenge the idea and not the person. We also want to remind you that individual presenter views do not necessarily represent the official ideas or beliefs of the University of Rochester, the Institute, or its partners. So Anne and Rose, do you see the waiting room there or no? No.
No, actually, which is weird.
Okay, so I'll just admit. The presenter has shared that sensitive content in today's session include topics on race, racism, racial violence, and violence against Indigenous communities. In order to enable the live transcript in your Zoom view, please click the arrow to the live transcript box, which I will enable right now. That box can be dragged to another location on your screen. And we are recording today's session, so please note that your spoken, written comments and image may be included as well as transcript. So in order to protect your privacy, we invite you to rename your profile with just your first name and your pronouns if you're comfortable. And this session will end promptly at its end time, and we will start directly following with Michelle Harris's presentation, followed by a collective processing discussion of the two sessions together. So without further ado, it is my great honor to welcome Andrea Gluckman for her presentation called Museum Born of Massacre, Art and the Hidden History of the Elaine Massacre.
Thank you, Missy. Thank you. Thanks to all of you for being here. I know it's been a long day and a long week. So I'm just going to hop right into this. I welcome you all in this kind of journey prototype presentation for the Elaine Museum. And I'll get into that. So for the purposes of this conversation, I am a photographer. I'm a visual artist. I am technically the artist in residence for the Elaine Museum and Richard Wright Civil Rights Center. And that is going to be the museum of discussion. I live in Rochester, but it is important for me to let you know that I am originally from Arkansas, which is where Elaine is located. My family is from Elaine and the surrounding areas. And it is, that will be an important factor in this discussion. So before we really dig into a discussion, I, like you all as creatives, really can appreciate stories being told artistically. And that is not within my capacity. So I would like to share with you a trailer for a documentary that a colleague of mine is making about the impact of the Elaine Massacre of 1919 on Elaine now. But with the music and the folks that are interviewed in this 1.5 minute clip, friends of mine now, people who are very dear to me, I feel will be able to communicate the elements that I won't be able to communicate. So I would like to share my screen with you now. And I will share the sound. And all right.
There's a lot of prejudice in this town.
As far as I can see it, it haven't changed one bit.
The main street of Elan is divided.
Black on one side and white on the other side. It's just where we at.
People are afraid to talk today about the Elaine race riot.
Because they feel like history might repeat itself.
My great-grandfather, Ed Coleman, and a group of others just wanted something fair wage for the crops that they brought in.
See, them boys came back here to Phillips County, and they came back here trying to help they people get a better position economically, and they murdered them for that.
And it's not about the past, it's about now.
This ain't no damn game. They murdered these people, and they still murdering. And they'd murder us right now if they knew what we was up in here up to.
The land need to be healed, understanding what we've been through. The history of Elan, the suffering, might enable us to move forward.
You can't walk out there and walk through this stuff and don't feel it. You'll hear those spirits whispering through the wind. All of these things are gonna be paid for. They gotta be paid for. And listen, ain't none of us gonna be able to sit this one out.
Lord, I never turn back no more.
Now, every person whom you just saw in this trailer, they are all descendants of the Elaine Massacre of 1919. And again, they are all very dear to me at this point. So what I'd like to do is just give you a few data points before we hop into how does a museum fit into all of this. So the Elaine Massacre happened in the Red Summer of 1919. Red Summer being a term that people are more familiar with now than they used to be. Usually Tulsa, the Tulsa Wall Street Massacre is what comes to mind. And in fact, there were a number of acts of horrendous violence against Black communities all throughout the South and elsewhere. So the broader context, though, was after World War I, there were a lot of Black veterans returning to the States, many of them back to the South. Now, Phillips County, which is the county in which Elaine is, was actually a desirable place for a number of Black communities. It was a place of great Black prosperity. We hear about Tulsa as if it is an anomaly in that there was Black prosperity, and that in my research and a number of other people's is absolutely untrue. There were many pockets of Black prosperity. Phillips County was one. So as these veterans were returning, there was land available for purchase, and this is some of the richest soil, not only in the United States, but in the world. It sits between two big rivers, Mississippi being one of them, and it was, again, a place where it was 10 Black individuals to every one white individual, and it was a place of pilgrimage for people to go. So that is kind of the context of Elaine. But what do we know about the massacre itself? Well, there is a lot that we know. There's a lot that we don't know. There are a number of narratives surrounding the massacre, but honestly, there is no definitive answer on how many people were killed, when did it begin, who fired the first shot, where was it fired? Again, a lot of ambiguity, but here is what we do know. And I'm going to repeat myself here, but it's important. Elaine was a place of great Black prosperity. We know this largely through a novel written by Richard Wright, who's the namesake of our Civil Rights Center, the novelist who wrote Native Son, Black Boy, and just scads of others. And in Black Boy, chapter 2, he talks about his growing up in Elaine with his uncle Silas and his aunt Margaret. It was one of the few places where he experienced plenty. He was full. After dinner, he lived in a place where he marveled that there were, it was a place of safety and prosperity. And then his uncle Silas was lynched in 1916, just a few years before the massacre, for not selling his tavern to a white man. And that is largely what launched Richard Wright's career. So among many other things, the Richard Wright connection is important. So I do want to mention that. What else do we know about the massacre? We know that Black families and Black individuals were targeted indiscriminately, women, men, and children. It was likened, and this is a quote, to a turkey shoot. Anyone who would move was shot at by white mobs that came, strangely, not necessarily from Elan, but from surrounding areas and from just across the river in Mississippi. Why did all of this happen? Well, you know, the bigger structural question is the one we're trying to deal with as a nation. But this specific instance, there are a few different stories. One is that there was a labor dispute. So if you look, I'm going to see if my cursor will work down here at Hoop Spur, which is on this map. There was a meeting that was a union meeting. The Progressive Farmers and Household Union of America were trying to organize a number of Black sharecroppers, Black and white, actually. Arkansas also had the Southern Tenant Farmers Union. So if you're interested in any kind of labor organizing history, you need to look at Arkansas. But anyhow, the kind of typical narrative is that while these people were organizing, a white deputy came and shooting ensued, etc. And did that happen? Nobody knows for sure. Assuredly, that is a piece of the story, but there is a much bigger and much more ominous story behind it too, which has a lot to do with land theft. Because as we know, this was a prosperous area. As people were hunted down and murdered or, you know, fled out of fear, their lands were appropriated by folks who lived in the town, to the point where generational wealth was lost within the period of a week during this massacre. What else do we know about this massacre? We know that the National Guard was called in by the governor of Arkansas at the time, ostensibly to quell the violence, but the violence was against the Black community. Therefore, the National Guard enacted further violence against the Black community. And there is a whole set of truth and reconciliation and reparations that is being configured to think about how to deal with that aspect of the massacre. So a few other things we know, sadly, but not surprisingly, is that the narrative of the violence was twisted before the violence was even over. You can see here through some of the older newspaper publications, and Howard University has done an excellent study of how press was involved in the Red Summer perpetuating violence, how the Black press dealt with things differently than the white press, etc. So I'm happy to pass that info along later. But as you can see, the narrative was totally switched around, that it was a riot. It was saying that it was an uprising of Black folks against the peaceful white inhabitants of Elan, and that we all know is untrue. So I wanted to be sure that that was made clear. Also important for where we are now in Elan is that no white individuals were ever arrested, convicted, indicted, anything for any of the violence. Not surprising. A number of Black individuals were, including the Elan 12. And when a lot of people hear about Elan, they often don't know necessarily much about the massacre, but they may have heard of these 12 men. It is said that they were innocent of any wrongdoing. They had a kind of a kangaroo court, an all-white jury. Within 6 minutes returned death penalties or death sentences. And shockingly, the Supreme Court, the case made it all the way to the Supreme Court, and the men were exonerated. And that case is Moore v. Dempsey from 1923. So another interesting data point. So these are some of the things that we do know. We don't know how many people were killed. We don't know where the bodies are. You can see here that there are a number of killing fields. I've been taken to a number of different places around Elaine, rock quarries, the Mississippi River. Essentially, all of Elaine is seen as sacred ground. One last quick thing before I leave this, a bit of good news that the term Elaine Race Riot was recently changed in the Library of Congress after much struggle to the Elaine Race Massacre. And language does matter. And we know that history matters. What else do we know about this massacre? We know that people tried to shut it down. People tried to shut down people talking about it, tried to shut down people grieving. And it was called the hush mouth. And this is a real picture, y'all, real picture of something that was posted in Phillips County, basically saying, hey, the soldiers were here. Nobody, nobody who was innocent got arrested. Y'all just go home and hush your mouths. And this hush mouth has lasted for over 100 years. The Elaine Massacre was not taught in Arkansas history and still isn't in a number of cases until possibly a year ago. I am 47 years old. I learned about the Elaine Massacre, having my family from this area probably about 4 years ago. There are descendants of the massacre who did not know about the massacre. The power of this hush mouth is intense. It is terroristic intimidation, and it continues to this day. As you heard in the video, people are afraid to talk about it. So we do know that the hush mouth has been powerful. All right, well, let's fast forward to the Elaine of today. The effects of the massacre are evident everywhere in that the population has dropped dramatically. Unfortunately, it has one of the highest poverty rates in the country, certainly the highest poverty rate in Arkansas. This whole county does. It's a deeply, deeply agricultural county. And because it's a deeply agricultural county, unfortunately, the health indicators are also not very good. Extremely high rates of cancer from the pesticides. Ironically, it is in a food desert. There's no grocery store within an hour's drive. Schools have been shut down. The kids are bussed out about an hour and a half. No jobs really to speak of. And every day, people, descendants of these massacres, of this massacre, walk the streets and drive past the places where ancestors were never recovered. So this is the Elaine of today. It's still extremely divided and certainly has a number of challenges. This is not the prosperous Elaine that Richard Wright wrote about. So enter an organization that's really been an incredible organization. Anybody who's interested in studying nonprofits as a case study, I implore you to look into the Elaine Legacy Center. It is a nonprofit run by descendants with the spoken goal of preserving the oral narratives, the stories of these descendants. There's no one left alive who physically witnessed the massacre, but their children and their grandchildren and their great-grandchildren are still in Elaine, and they do have these stories. So the Elaine Legacy Center started as a project largely to document these and to preserve them, but has ended up becoming a de facto community center to address all of these needs that are not being met by the locality, by the state, by the federal government. So, there's food pantry, vaccine clinics, GED classes, Zumba, all kinds of youth programming, a computer lab, all kinds of arts programming that I'm working on, vacant lot farming, really an amazing set of things. But front and center, in addition to those acute needs, is the need to memorialize this story and to do it in a way that could possibly bring financial stability, equity, prosperity even back to Elaine. And the way that it is occurring, at least that we are working really hard on, is through this idea of a museum. So here is the building that the museum is going to be housed in. It was a drugstore for a long time. It has served a number of purposes over time. Ironically, during the Elaine Massacre of 1919, this building was kind of a hub of white mob activity because it's at the crossroads of Main Street. So the people at the Elaine Legacy Center bought it. It's everything that has happened with this museum has been upending traditional narratives and upending power dynamics. And this is one of the biggest ways that this was seen. So this is what we had on the building for quite some time while we're trying to raise money, which we are becoming more successful at. Here is an artistic rendering. It won't be the Legacy Center though, this will be the museum. You can see the construction going on here. So the idea of this museum would not be just to house memories of the massacre, clearly, but to try to bring in all the different elements of the rural Arkansas Delta. There is a long-standing indigenous community, and there are still burial mounds in the area that are being farmed over, but we'll get to that in a minute. And Chinese communities. And we actually, the building that this is in most recently was owned by a Chinese family that has a long history in the area. So, and to bring in, you know, the different white elements from Elaine too. I've interviewed a number of families who speak of the massacre in terms of their mother hiding people who were running away from the massacre, similar to what you may hear about during World War II. I mean, people really trying to step up and do the right thing. There are all kinds of stories that need to be memorialized. But that really honestly is kind of the philosophical background. The idea for the museum is to really make all of Elaine the museum, the sites of the mass graves, the fields where people are farming now, the last Black family farm that's out like on Highway 49. I mean, all of these things, that the land itself is meant to be the museum, and the building is the entry into that. And ideally through that, as a community, people can come in, can be able to reflect, have difficult conversations, but it's also a community center in which the descendants themselves can determine how they want to write their own story, if that makes any sense. One thing that's been really pretty amazing is that we have been able and successful, and this part kind of shocks me, at tapping into cultural heritage funds because they are aplenty in the South, and they are not really meant for this kind of thing, if you know what I mean. It is all kinds of funding for the Civil War Park and for, you know, the Delta Byway bike trail that it's way too hot to bike on, and only a certain class of person would be able to do that given the amount of money it would cost, etc. So the ability to tap into that funding has been a lifeline for this project. And the idea is to get this museum to be the anchor for downtown development, because there are people actively trying to de-develop Elaine, the small bit that's even there. And the idea of this being the revitalizing factor is really pretty phenomenal, because with the museum comes restaurants, and with restaurants come hotels and tour groups. People already are finding out about the massacre and just kind of driving around aimlessly, looking to learn. And so the descendants said, hey, well, we are going to tap right into that, and maybe that's the ticket to prosperity. And finally, the use of the museum is a way as creatives to use art and placemaking to engage critically with some really, really tough histories. So all that being said, you know, I've encountered this a lot with trying to get funding for the museum. And what I hear a lot is, wow, well, that's not a neutral history that you all are going to be memorializing or going to be encasing. And I'm like, yeah, no kidding. Museums are not neutral. In fact, there's a whole movement out there that museums are not neutral. They've never been neutral. I mean, it's about who has the power to tell a story, who has the power to say what historically happened, who has the power to determine what art is seen as traditional, or to tell one specific story of a site and not all of the others. You know, we've all encountered this. And so our friend here, Swanapa, I think beautifully said, the institutionalization of history is a political craft. It redacts, edits, and omits in order to bind and constitute communities. So the museum itself is an act of curatorial activism. And in the museum world is new to me, but as I slowly kind of tiptoe into it, I am seeing this curatorial activism find its way in a number of places, seeping into these different crevices, even here in Rochester. So a museum, traditional museum may be a quote unquote trusted institution to some, but of course it can invoke trauma. For others, theft of culture, imperialist projects. We want this to be a truly public forum and to be created for and by descendants of the massacres. All right, done with that. So let's think for a minute about the challenges, because this is really why I'm here with all of you. The biggest challenges that we're facing that are not the white supremacists who are threatening to burn it down, which, you know, just happened yesterday, and a number of other very physical challenges and funding challenges. The intellectual challenges are also steep, and that is, how do you create a museum without artifacts? How do you create a museum of a history that you cannot, quote unquote, prove? What does it mean for things to be evidentiary? What is evidence? Who gets to control that? Because I will tell you one thing, land deeds of the folks who were killed in that massacre were burned. There is no evidence. Bodies decompose very quickly in this part of the world because of the soil and because of flooding. There have been massive floods every 10 years or so. So it is not likely that we are going to bump into artifacts and evidence that prove the way that things happened. And if so, not sure that we would ever be able to actually display them. So the idea kind of upends our notion of truth and our notion of trusted sources. This will be a museum of the oral narrative. This will be a museum of the descendant telling the story of his grandmother, of her uncle, of things that they saw, that they knew, that they heard about in hushed tones in the kitchen when they were little. But that indeed is a challenge, and how to do it responsibly. How do we witness a history that has always been hidden, that has been deliberately buried through the hush mouth, that continues with intimidation, with gerrymandering the districts in the county, with chopping down the memorial tree twice, 2 different willow trees for descendants, for victims who are dead. I mean, it really blows the mind. So how is it that we can witness this history and again do it responsibly? And finally, how this is my challenge, is how do I create art or, you know, work in community with Elaine to create art that can show the invisible? And it's really been a challenge. Again, it's another reason I'm here, because I am not sure exactly how to do it, and I'm working on it. One way that I am trying to think about it is by working on what Sally Mann, the photographer, talks about is emotional information in an image. And emotional information is hard to get at, especially if there are no people in the image. And in this area, you're working with landscapes. And often when people think of landscapes, I mean, we're talking about mountains and, you know, vacation pictures and sunsets. And that's not what this is about. This is about land that witnessed decades and still is witnessing tragedies, but also how life continues to move on. And as an example, a few of the things that I've done is I got a drone because I was not allowed on private property, because in Arkansas law, you can't do that, to go and photograph what's out in these fields. And look, y'all, it's a Hopewell Indian burial mound. That's what this is right here. And this is cotton. I film it every time I go down, and it's being farmed over. And we've noticed that it's been shrinking for quite some time. One thing that's harder to see, but where my cursor is, are white stones. These are broken tombstones from 1919. And those are from people who were lucky enough, lucky is not the right word, but who had at least the dignity of being buried at one point. So this is one way, just technically speaking, logistically speaking, to try to get at some of the secrets of the landscape, and then trying to present it from different angles. Another way that I'm thinking about and trying to honor and witness this history is obviously through portraits. It's a little bit more complicated because, as you can imagine, it takes a lot of relationship building and a lot of trust building. And the folks in Elaine have a lot of reason not to trust anybody coming in, just because people come in, they get the story and they leave and they write a book and they never see them again. So, you know, luckily these are relationships that are important to me. I've been crafting for some time. This is James, who's the director of the center, a very dear friend, and just had his 60th birthday. And anyhow, this is one of the first times that he took me out to see the sites of what we believe are the mass graves. And his quote, this is the quote that he gives all the media, which is, before 1919, we were proud landowners, business people, educators, professionals. And in 1919, we became poor in 3 days. So I'm just going to leave you with a few images and a few thoughts, because again, y'all, I'm really struggling with how to artistically present things that that may seem very ordinary. If you're in the South, in the Delta especially, and you're driving, flying down the highway, you're going to look around, you're not going to see much of interest. You know, it's flat, it's not textured, the sky is usually not textured, it's hot, it's hazy, like there's not a lot to see in terms of anything that would reflect the gravity and the history and the beauty and the terror of all the things that have occurred. And I'm committed to trying to find a way to show that. So again, I went back to Sally Mann, who talks a lot about land and site and place, and says that the land will not remember by itself, but the artist will. Susan Sontag was another one. You know, she said that, what was it? The painter constructs and the photographer discloses. So I'm trying to work on disclosing truths by showing things that might look normal, like this tree, but you must be suspicious of any old tree in the South. And this tree has its own history. So what do? You play around with tone, you play with color, you play with whatever it is to make the viewer uncomfortable enough to say, why is it being presented this way? The Great Mississippi, which unfortunately is the Middle Passage for the Delta. Untold numbers of people who have, you know, lived and died by this river. And a number of the mass graves, which actually was the original reason why I was, that's how I got involved with this organization. Because when I found out about the massacre, I kind of stopped everything I was doing. I was able to, though, because I was able to do that, and kind of left everything, went to Arkansas and said, what am I going to do? And they said, go take some pictures. You're a photographer. So this will be part of the first exhibit at the museum. So I know my time's coming to a close. I did not mean to talk this long, but just to remind y'all, not that you need it, because you are creatives out there in the world of social justice and change. But I think it is very true that that the power of the arts writ large can be disarming in a way that some people don't understand. And it allows for conversations to happen, very challenging conversations to happen in ways that perhaps they could not happen otherwise. It can also help communities in unpacking trauma if there is control over that narrative. And that ultimately is our goal. So thank you. I will be sure that you have all the information about this museum and Civil Rights Center. It is set to open in September, assuming it doesn't get burned down. We have a website, we have an Instagram, we're raising money like crazy. And thank you.
Andrea, that was amazing. Thank you for shedding light on this history that, I certainly knew nothing about. We have 7 minutes before your end time. And even though we'll have a collective discussion later, if anyone does have any ideas in response to Andrea's question, please feel free to turn on your microphone or enter it in the chat, etc. I have an idea, but I see Anne's hand raised, so let's go to her first.
I'll be quick. One, I also want to just say, Andrea, when you said there's no people in it, where's the emotion? There is so much emotion in every one of those photos. It's unbelievable. I was wondering if you looked to cities like Berlin and that also are recognizing a collective, owning up to the atrocities of their heritage. I'll just put it at that because I think we all understand.
Yeah. Excellent. Thank you, Anne.
Ezra, go ahead.
Yeah, I want to hear more about what you mean by, like, when you say you want to represent it responsibly, because I agree that that's very important. But I'm just curious, like, for a situation like this where, like you said, there's not like very concrete evidence, like it's more like story driven and like based on what people have heard. Like, how do you even tell what is like the way these people would want it to be represented, and like how are you going to grapple with that challenge?
Oh my God, Ezra, that is an incredible question, and that honestly has been the question with the capital Q as a creative, right? And I don't know, honestly. What I do know, and what we are very lucky with, is that we have an entire town worth of people who want to do this. So basically, when I go down, I just shut up. I just listen. I listen and I listen, and I go to barbecues, and my kids hang out with, with everybody else's kids. And we really, it's a labor of love and of getting to know people and really trying to listen. And that sounds so hinky and ridiculous and ineffective, but it's not. The deep listening, the critical listening. That being said, I also think it's extremely important, because my background is not at all in photography or the arts. I was a political analyst in the Middle East for most of my life. So this is all kind of new in this sense. But it's important to also do your research, right? To go out, to have a sense of the questions to ask, to have a framework. So when somebody tells you, they're not having to bear the burden yet again of explaining this to another uninformed, white person, honestly. So I want to, I'm doing my best to go out and learn as much as I can so I can come back with informed questions and frameworks, but it has to be led by the descendants or it's not worth doing. in every step of the way. And we are having a town hall to try to pull people into, okay, so what do you want this to look like? You know, we're starting off with this one exhibit, but you know, the youth are also involved. It's going to be a community space. We're on the Civil Rights Trail, like all these other things are going to happen. But right now we're just trying to have something so we can get funding so we can get it up and running. That's really helpful. Thank you.
I would just,
Gotcha. Yeah, thank you.
I would just add that the nature of qualitative research is just gathering all kinds of different information, artifacts, stories, et cetera, right? And so even if you don't have the original person, like if you have a number, like numbers of stories, that's that person's truth, right? And so if there's 3 sides to every story, right? So I think just the gathering is the work, right? I was going to share that we have a colleague in studio art here. Her name is Evelyn LeBlanc Roberge.
Okay.
And she has been doing a project, or, you know, over a number of years with women, incarcerated women. And she corresponds with them via letters. And she has asked them to describe the space they live in and the space that they imagine living in. And she's a photographer by trade. And then she fabricates the spaces they imagine living in. She takes a photograph of them and she sends it to them. And so as a thought for how you know, like maybe you can't, you know, not that you want to reenact what happened, but at the same time, like this idea of like a fabricated thing that's based on these stories maybe is something to consider.
I appreciate that, Missy. And you know what? I really think you're on to something. I did a small group of photographs, but I didn't show them because I didn't feel like it was right yet, but like a dream sequence. And it would not be for people, you know, again, it's that whole balancing of you don't want to re-traumatize people for the sake of art or for any reason. But some of the stories that were told to me by James, that his grandmother had said about, you know, his grandmother hiding in the swamps and seeing flashlights. And so when you're in the Delta, you get a lot of pictures of fields and swamps because that's kind of all there is. And so I started playing around with post-production using flares to create the flashlights and, you know, to try to help people understand that fear. But then, of course, my concern is I don't, you know, it is again being sure that it is not something that would be consumed and re-traumatize communities, because that would be the exact opposite. But you're totally onto something. And the dream sequence of creating this prosperous Elaine, this Richard Wright's Elaine. And his daughter, Julia, by the way, is still alive, if you can even believe this. And she is deeply involved in our work. She's hugely involved. She lives in Europe, but is very involved in trying to abolish the death penalty here in the US, and even published one of Richard Wright's books very recently that was found. It was not published in the 50s because it was about police brutality. Nobody would publish it. It's called The Man Who Lived Underground. Anyway, I would love, she and I are talking about how can I present his Elaine to show people that it can be like that again, that it existed to give rise to artistic inspiration for somebody like Richard Wright, who, by the way, if you haven't read any of his books, you need to, please run out.
Amazing.
I wonder what that Elaine sounded like at that time. And also, what did it sound like afterwards when they were like, for those who were still alive, what did they sing? What were their songs? And what did they pass on?
Yes, yes, yes. And that's why that is so great, Michelle. That is why I wanted y'all to see that trailer too, because that's Vera. And Vera sings for the community, right? But she's she's a descendant. She's a huge part of the community. But you're exactly right that there is I'm sorry, I can't even think, because that was just such a great thing for me to go back and think about. I have to write it down because I'm not going to remember. Yes, yes, absolutely.
I just wanted to say that your photo, what I felt like they were really capturing is absence.
Yes.
It's like every single one felt like absence to me. And like a kind of, some of them felt like a void.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Oh, that makes me so happy.
Something missing, like there was something missing in every single one.
I am so glad to hear that. And you know, I keep going back to Sally Mann, who, you know, has issues, but one thing that I think she does well is talk about the beautiful and terrible indifference of the Southern landscape. And largely for the same reasons, because she's done a lot of work on this too. But, you know, again, how do you differentiate a landscape, texture it to make it beautiful, but to make people uncomfortable? And that could be, again, like color palette. It could be lines, like with the hanging tree, where it gets you off kilter just enough. I mean, you all are creatives. You know how to do this in all your crafts. And I honestly I mess around with these until I'm uncomfortable. And I'm like, okay, I think it's ready. But the idea is to invoke that absence and to say, why was this image even taken? What happened here? And all of the sites, like if you saw in the trailer, Anthony was the gentleman who said, you know, you can't go out and not hear the spirits whispering in the wind. And he is also part Oneida indigenous too. So he's got an amazing story. But anyway, so like Anthony says, just being there, you know, it's all hallowed ground. So you just want to be able to capture that for other people.